over here. Position my Yoseba. There you go. You didn't hear that. just cat here. Ugh. Okay. Hopefully the lighting is not too. I'm gonna fix the light a little bit. It's too much from the screen. And actually, this time intro first. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson reads The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Yes, I am back with a new reading stream series, and we're gonna do something very different. This for the next little while, and I know like you guys put up with me reading like how many 10 different Bible books, but we're gonna do something totally different. Not totally different. I mean, I've read other books on stream, but today we're going to read. I'm gonna change my camera a little bit. Today we're gonna read the Canterbury Tales. Now you're wondering what the heck is the Canterbury Tales? Well. That was awkward lighting. I have to like hold it here. What is the Canterbury Tales? Well, the Canterbury Tales is a series of short stories. Although there is like an overarching narrative, but the overarching narrative is not really that important. So basically, I would say it's a well-known piece of literature. I would say that, but unfortunately, a lot of people, especially in like the modern education system, you don't really hear a lot of people don't know what the Canterbury Tales is. Like, I will make references to it pretty frequently, and nobody will know what the hell I'm talking about. And this is across the board, whether it's I'm talking to young people, usually people in their early 20s. Even when I'm talking to people my age group, a lot of people my own age group don't even know what the Canterbury Tales is. And even people like the older, a little bit older than me, they're very unfamiliar. Like they've heard, like they would have heard of it, but they like know nothing about it. But that's a real shame, because I think the Canterbury Tales is a great set of stories. And so I'm not going to give too much of an introduction to it. The story kind of introduces itself. But just a quick kind of, I guess, quick rundown of what it is. So, the Canterbury Tales is a series of short stories during the Middle Ages. Well, okay, that's pretty shitty explanation, because the Middle Ages is actually a pretty long span of time. I guess since the Canterbury Tales was kind of like Middle English time period. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the Middle English was a time was an early time in the English language's history, where there was an older English, the Saxon language, and the Saxon language has been kind of lost through history because nobody speaks it, and two, there wasn't a lot of writing of like this older Saxon language. And the Saxon language, the Saxons came into what is now the British Isles roughly, don't want to mess up my history here, but roughly the 600 AD-ish. And then as the Saxons expanded in what is now I guess England. Well, of course, it expands to like Wales and other parts of the United Kingdom, but not the entirety, obviously, because there were other people groups like the Scottish. But basically, as the Saxons expanded, they tried to develop their language, and that was what we call the Anglo-Saxon language. And that was pretty short-lived because, of course, the French show up, and the French kind of take over because the French were pretty badass in the early Middle Ages, and they just kicked the shit out of so many people after like defeating. Trying to remember the actual general's name, but after this particular French general kicked the shit out of like the early Ottoman Empire in about the 1100s. The French got super bold, and so they went on like a whole like mass conquest in Europe. And of course, when they took over the British Isles and overtook the Saxon people, they developed a language, a new language that was a weird mix of like the Saxon language and French. And people refer to this as Middle English. And that was kind of so that kind of happened, well, the whole French conquest thing was like, what, 1100s? So the Canterbury Tales takes place roughly like 1400, the 14th century, the late 14th century. And so that's like late 1300s. And so during this time period, this was where like a lot of the development of what would later become the British culture kind of comes in. And yes, as much contention as there is between the English and the French, the English should remember that a big part of their history was because of the French. Because if it wasn't for the French trying to create this whole Middle English culture, they would have just remained like the Nordic barbarians that they started out as. But that French culture and this creation of this Middle English language. And then, of course, I'm not reading in Middle English, mind you. I don't know jack shit of Middle English. I just know modern English, and of course, a little more history. Maybe we'll do this down the line at some point. But William Shakespeare was the pioneer of what is now modern English. Of course, the English he was working with and the English he was developing is called the Late English. I know that sounds weird. We call it Late English and then Modern English as we move into like the Enlightenment period. But that's its own crazy long ass history lesson that we're not going to spend that much time on today. But basically the context of understanding the Canterbury Tales is that during the late 1300s, as English culture was developing a lot more, something else that kind of came up that was pretty important was this kind of separation between the Church of France, I don't know why I said it that way, the Church of France and the English creating their own like clerical system and the way that the church operated. Of course, in modern day that would be Anglicanism, and Catholicism, or I guess for the English it would be Anglicanism, and the French were predominantly Catholic. Of course, that doesn't get really formalized until much later with Martin Luther and the Reformation, but that's also like that's its own series of lectures that I could do like 10 streams on the whole Protestant Reformation. So yeah, we're just gonna leave that alone for now. But basically, during the time period of the Canterbury Tales, it was the beginning of this kind of split between the English identity and the French identity within the religious world. This breaking away from French Catholicism into, well, it wasn't called Anglicanism at the time, but you basically get the idea. And a little bit of like Christianity 102, I guess. But the Anglicanism is they claim it's a particular form of Christianity that, even though it claims to be separate from the Catholic Church, and thus a Protestant group, I guess you could say, they still behave very much with the Catholic ordinances, and so a lot of those traditions still are still prevalent in the Anglican tradition. And one of those traditions, and coming back to the Canterbury Tales, one of those traditions is what we call a pilgrimage. Now, before I explain what a pilgrimage is, I'm just going to say, hello, Gauntlets, that's what I'm calling you now. Hello, Gauntlets, welcome to the stream. I am doing fine today. Didn't get the time to shave, really, because I was busy doing stuff. I'm just noticing now as I look at like the playback, I'm like, God, maybe I should have shaved before I did today's stream. But whatever, too late now, right? Anyway, I hope your day is doing well, and back to the preface of the Canterbury Tales. So a pilgrimage. Most people might have a general idea of what a pilgrimage is, and the basic idea is the traveling to a holy place. That's a pretty safe way of putting it. I couldn't use like a good older example. We'll use a modern example first to explain what a pilgrimage is. Popular game, 20 years. I think it is its 20th birthday this year for Final Fantasy X. And in Final Fantasy X, the main character, not Titus, Yuna, makes a pilgrimage. And the idea is that Yuna is supposed to develop her skills as a summoner, and then she travels to a holy place in Zanarkand. And then there she's supposed to get like the final Aeon, and then like kill Sin. But of course, spoiler for a 20-year-old game, by the way, the whole thing ends up being a sham. So maybe not the best example of talking about like a pilgrimage. But the idea is that a person goes through like a religious journey, if you will, and they arrive to like some holy place. And so, as far as the Canterbury Tales is concerned, in England, that would be, at the time, of course, you know, it moves around. But, I mean, it's still venerated today, as a matter of... it's still venerated today as, like, a high, very important place in the Anglican tradition is the Church of Canterbury. And the Church of Canterbury would have been a place that many English Christians would have gone to from all over the Isles. And so, that is where our story begins. Skip this introduction here, because I actually haven't, okay, so funny little thing, before I actually start reading, is that I originally was going to read this book a lot earlier. I've always wanted to read this book on stream, and you'll kind of quickly find out why that's the case. But one of the problems I had was that I couldn't find my copy. I think I lost it somewhere. And so I had to I bought another copy just over a week ago. I mean, Lord provides, I guess. And so I was looking, I wanted to read this at some point for you guys. And so I think the beginning, it's already, oh God, it's already weird to think it's already March of 2023. But at the beginning of 2023, I was like, hey, when we go back to reading streams, I'm going to read something a little different. And so the Canterbury Tales was my first pick, but I couldn't find my copy. And here we are. I finally found my copy. Anyway, that's a weird side story about that. But we're already 15 minutes in, and I haven't read a single word of this book yet. So here we go. We're going to begin at the introduction of the Canterbury Tales. Of course, unfortunately, unlike my Bible reading streams, I can't have you read along with me per se. Because unless you buy your own copy of the Canterbury Tales, and it's not an easy thing to find. Like, you can find the prologue online, because the prologue, they can just give you that. But the rest of the stories, you kind of have to, like, get your own copy of the book. I mean, I would say that I would encourage you guys to actually read along, because I think that reading the Canterbury Tales is a great reading experience. But maybe down the line, oh no, old books. I kind of wrecked the little bit of the glue. It's an old book, you can tell, so I bought this secondhand, pretty cheap. But maybe down the line I'll buy another copy of the book. Yeah, I know I'm one of those people. I have like multiple copies of the same book. And the Canterbury Tales may very well be one of those books, because I absolutely love the Canterbury Tales. But anyway, let us begin. The Canterbury Tales. When the sweet showers of April have pierced the dryness of March to its root and soaked every vein in moisture, those quickening forces engenders the flower. When Zephyr, with his sweet breath, has given life to tender shoots in each wood and field. When the young sun has run his half course in the sign of the ram. When nature prompting their instincts, small birds who sleep through the night, with one eye open to make their music. Then people long to go on pilgrimages, the pious wanderers to visit strange lands and far-off shrines in different countries. In England, especially, they come from every shire's end to Canterbury to seek out the holy blessed martyr St. Thomas à Becket, who helped them when they were sick. It happened one day at this time of year, while I was lodging at the Tavern of Southwark, ready and eager to go on my pilgrimage to Canterbury. A company of 29 people arrived in Holstery at nightfall. They were of various sorts, accidentally brought together in companionship, all pilgrims wishing to ride to Canterbury. The rooms and stables were commodious, and we were looking very well. In short, by the time the sun had gone down, I had talked with every one of them, and soon became one of their company. We agreed to rise early to set out on the journey. I am going to tell you about. But nevertheless, I take the story further. It seems right to me to describe, while I have the time and opportunity, the sort of condition of each of them as they appeared to me. Who they were, and of what rank, and how dressed. I shall begin with the knight. The knight was a very distinguished man. From the beginning of his career, he had loved chivalry, loyalty, honorable dealing, generosity, and good breeding. He had fought bravely in the king's service, besides which he had traveled further than most men in heathen as well as in Christian lands. Whenever he went, he was honored for his valor. And he was at Alexandria when it fell. When he served in Prussia, it was generally given the seat of honor above the knights of all other nations. No Christian soldier of his rank had fought oftener in the raids of Russia and Lithuania, and he had been to Granada at the siege of Algeciras, fought in Ben Marin, and the conquest of Aes and Attila. Besides taking part in many armed expeditions in the eastern Mediterranean, the knight has been in 15 pitched battles and fought 3 times for the faith in the list of Tremassine, and each time killed his foe. This same distinguished knight has also fought at one time for the king of Palathia against another heathen enemy in Turkey. He was always outstandingly successful. Yet though distinguished, he was prudent, and his bearing as modest as a maid's. In his whole life he never spoke discourteously to any kind of man. He was a true and perfect noble knight. But speaking of his equipment, his horses were good, yet he was not gaily dressed. He wore a tunic of thick cotton cloth, rust-marked from his coat of mail, for he had just come back from his travels, and was making his pilgrimage to render thanks. Now with him came his son, a young squire, a spirited apprentice, a lover with hair as curly as if it had just been pressed in the tongs. I suppose his age was about 20. He was of average height, wonderfully active and strong. In Flanders, Artois, and Picardy he had taken part in chivalry forays, and in the short space of time he had bore himself well, for he hoped to win favour in his lady's eyes. He was decked out like a meadow full of fresh flowers, white and red. He whistled or sang the whole day long, as lively as the month of May. His gown was short, with long wide sleeves. The squire was a good rider, and sat his horse well. He was also able to compose songs, and set them to music, joust, and also dance, and he could draw and write. Being passionately in love, at night he slept no more than a nightingale. Courteous, modest, and willing to serve, he carved for his father at the table. I'll read one more and then we're going to take a short break to kind of talk about what's going on here, because there's a lot of text. So. The knight had a yeoman and no other servants, for that was how he preferred to travel on this occasion. The yeoman was clad in a green coat and hood, and carried a sheep and sharp, bright, peacocked feather arrows slung handily from his belt, for he knew how to look after his gear in soldierly fashion. His arrows did not fall short because of poor feathering. And while in his hand he carried a mighty bow, he had a brown face, short cropped hair, and was adept in everything to do with woodcraft. On his arm he wore a gay armament, and a sword and buckler on one side. Upon the other a bright, well-mounted dagger, as sharp as a spear point, and on his breast a shining silver image of Saint Christopher. He carried a horn slung from a green belt. I'd say he was a forester. Okay, we're going to stop there for a quick second, just to kind of parse all this stuff that just happened. So the very beginning of this story kind of gives like the world building. And of course that's very important when you want to start off a story, like especially when you're going to talk about like an adventure that these people are going to go on. And so what's interesting about this little story is that this prologue is how Chaucer utilizes like local folklore, I guess you could say. And so Zephyr, a wind spirit, is the one attributed to like breathing life onto the land, which is interesting because I thought this whole thing of like a pilgrimage to a holy Christian church, you wouldn't be like emphasizing like other religion deities or stuff like that. I mean, Zephyr isn't exactly a god, but you get the point. As opposed to just saying like, well, God does everything, which is kind of the more traditionalist Bible, biblical worldview. But it's one of those things that like, and of course I've gotten criticism of this as well, where it's like you use these kind of um, very different mythological characters and stories to tell a larger narrative or to kind of get a point across when you're talking about like philosophy and stuff like that. And of course, like, if you guys have been here long enough, like, I do weird ass things. Like, I explain parts of the Bible using like anime and video games. So that's weird, right? And of course, like, I know there would be some criticism of that, like, oh, doesn't the Bible speak for itself? You don't use like pagan anime to like explain biblical concepts. But I think one of the things that many people lack, and it goes both ways. Okay, it's not just Christians that are running into this problem. It's also much of the secular world has greatly run into this problem, worse than a lot of Christians, which is in all to be real, like, the reason why so much modern media sucks is because I think there's a lack of respect for mythology. And I use that word mythology as like a umbrella, an overarching umbrella. But I think one of the things that's lacking in our culture is that there's a lack of respect for mythology. And that's why, like, you think of like a lot of reboots to like TV shows. Oh God, right? Like, there's a lack of respect to the source material. The mythology that was built up to make what that story what it is. I mean, you think of like a lot of Disney remakes and why they kind of fall short. I mean, you can't match up to the original animated classics, because with animation you can do a lot of fun stuff when you're doing like the Disney magic, if you will. But also I kind of notice is that there's a lack of mythology within the story, right? So Mulan is a good example of this. There's a lack of that kind of mystic element in the Mulan story. And of course, when the animated version did what it did, it wanted to tell a grander story than just kind of like this legend of like this Chinese hero Mulan. They wanted to tell a grander story, and the Disney movie did that very well because it expanded on a mythology. But the modern version doesn't really do that. It doesn't really tell a mythological story. And so there's a lost craft in that. But when you read something like the Canterbury Tales, there's this masterful respect to ancient folklore stories. And in a lot of ways, what many people forget is that actually, if you can utilize mythologies well in your storytelling, that's what makes it good. That's what gives it its power. Because one, if you can incorporate multiple mythologies into your new story, that shows skill. That shows a high level of skill and thought as you've made your mythology. I mean, think about an example I'll use is Ruby. Ruby is a kind of like it started out as like a magical school of like people who want to hunt these shadow creatures called the Grimm, and the hunters and huntresses. Huntsmen and huntresses, I guess, is what they're called in that world. But basically, when the earlier seasons really respected mythology well, and you can tell like a lot of the inspiration of various fairy tales to inspire their characters. So you had like Ruby, who was Red Riding Hood, and then Weiss, who was Snow White, and then Blake was who was Blake based on again? If I remember, Blake is kind of like Belle from Beauty and the Beast, and then Yang Xiaolong was Goldilocks, and then of course what made Ruby's kind of special and what made it had that original charm was the way that it took those mythological characters and then like did a funny little spin on them. But at the same time, even though they kind of changed the mythology of the characters, it kept a kind of it still respected the mythology. So even though like Ruby, she's a you're turning Little Red Riding Hood, a little innocent girl, into like a deadly warrior. But Ruby still has like a sense of naivete in her character. So there's that respect of like what Little Red Riding Hood is like. She is naive, and then Ruby within the story is very naive, especially early on. Of course, like, you know, as you go through the adventure, you learn and you mature. Of course, that's any hero's journey. But there's, even though like Ruby goes from, you know, Red Riding Hood goes from running from the wolves to killing wolves, and I mean, they're like the whole like one of the basic grims are like a wolf-like creature, and then like her, in Ruby's very first, um, they did like a little mini series before the series even started that kind of introduces each character, and the way they introduced Ruby was that she was a Red Riding Hood killing a bunch of wolves. It's hilarious, and so there was a respect of the original Little Red Riding Hood in Ruby's naivete, which would be used to push the, you know, to make a story. But at the same time, you know, the twist is that Ruby's also a badass. She can fight with a scythe, and she's awesome. And then Weiss is supposed to be Snow White. Now, of course, Snow White is, you know, she's attributed as being like the fairest in the land, and of course, in the original Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, that's kind of got two layers. She's of course supposed to be super beautiful, but she also has like, she has outer beauty and she has inner beauty. And so the irony with Weiss and Ruby is that Weiss is actually kind of mean, and she's very like tsundere, so she has that like outward mean kind of mean character. But what you actually, you know, as you see her character more, she actually does have like a very soft side, and she is very compassionate and cares for people, much like Snow White. And so there's that respect of the mythology. I'm not going to go through all four girls, but you kind of get the point here. And so what made Ruby good originally was that there was this interesting like take on these old fairy tale characters without disregarding the mythology. Without like, you're not just gonna make like, okay, like Ruby looks like Little Red Riding Hood, but she's nothing like her. Like that wouldn't have worked. And so that's why I remember when this was years ago, I remember when I first got into Ruby, and what made it attractive at the time was that that respect of the mythology was, it was very intriguing, and it also like gives interest because you think, wow, like these guys are like Monty Ohm, when he originally made Ruby, like he was a skilled, that shows skill in his writing and the way he thought of mythology. It showed skill that he was able to incorporate older fairy tale characters and then make a new interpretation of them in a combat heavy world, and that was very cool. And so going back to the Canterbury Tales, there's this kind of idea of like using mythology to show your skill as a writer. And one of the things that we'll see throughout the entire narrative, and we see through the short stories, is how, well, not just Chaucer, but all these people telling stories, most of them anyway, they have skill in their craft of being able to tell a good story. And of course, I mean, one of the things too, if this is like a critique of modern society, is that like one of the biggest problems we have is that and why a lot of TV is bad and a lot of movies and comics and stuff like that are pretty bad, is that, especially in the West anyway, anime is a little different, but, and I mean, I have a whole podcast about that, but one of the problems of modern Western writing is that there's a loss of the craft of writing, and to be able to write well. Now, of course, like, you know, sure, I can say that, like, oh, the writing in a lot of Western media sucks. But at the same time, it's one thing to criticize writing and to give a critique. It's another thing to actually be a skilled writer. Because I you know, I would tell you now, like, I probably could not write, like, a masterpiece. Probably not. If I were to try and write a story, like, that isn't like a short story, because short stories you can, well, short stories actually have, like, a difficulty to them as well. But anyway, this is not writing 101. To write a good story is not easy. But at the same time, that's the reason why we have such respect for skilled writers like Chaucer. And of course, as we go through the stories, you'll see the level of skill that these people can tell stories. Because of course, good storytelling is an essential part of society. But more on that later. So far I've introduced 3 characters. We're going to try and get through the whole introduction. I realized that, like, holy crap, we're already 40 minutes in and I've only introduced 3 of the characters. But basically, I showed off the first group, which had a knight, a squire, and a yeoman. So, what's interesting here is that, I guess you could say, like, Chaucer's talking about, like, the nobility class, and especially, like, the knight would for sure be of the nobility class. And holy hot damn, you know, you read, this is how you start off strong in your writing, and to give a good first impression. But Chaucer probably picked the knight to be the first person he talked about, because he wanted to make sure that, like you had respect for the people that, like, the nobility. And the knight would be this knight, he was like the cream of the crop. And I know some people, like, if you were to read this, like, okay, obviously, like, the story is meant to be fiction, but it really does, like, make you suspect of Chaucer's biases, I guess, as he writes. Because, you know, he picks the cream of the crop and just sings his praises at the beginning. And talks about this knight who's, like, he's gone on, like, the Crusades. Although, there's some contradictory information here. There's some information in here that's not reliable. So, when he talks about, like, the knight going all the way down to, like, the Middle East and, like, fighting at, like, Alexandria and those places. Of course, there's, like, some time bits that don't make sense. Because, like, for instance, the Crusades and the fall of Alexandria are, like, 2 very different time periods. So this knight is not, like, some kind of magic knight who, like, exists in multiple timelines. So there's a little bit of suspect in how Chaucer, and his credibility, I guess you could say, as a writer. I know I just talked about, like, him being a skilled writer. But I guess being a skilled writer and being a truthful writer are 2 different things. Any news media could tell you that. But basically, at the same time, Chaucer kind of wants to put the nobility and put them on a pedestal. And I guess part of it is, one, if you're going to talk about the nobility, you should, like, say good things about them. Like, don't talk mad shit about the nobility. Especially, like, the military. Of course, like, I know this sounds kind of weird because, like, you know, in our unfortunately in our modern age, we don't view, say, like, the military very favorably. But you think about, like, okay, in the Middle Ages, where people are scared of, like, bandit raids and crap like that, and of course, you know, unless the knights come and help, you're basically, like, totally screwed, right? If there was, like, bandit raids and other, like, counties and areas fighting each other and get locked into warfare. I mean, that's why the military is so important. And of course, in a smaller world, as weird as that sounds, where people are quicker to attack each other, of course your knightly military was kind of really important. And so Chaucer may want to just show respect to that, because you want to paint the knights as being, like, noble and being protectors of the innocent, because of course another thing to think about is how, like, how could people live peacefully and have a good life while it's for other people who fight the tough battles. And, you know, it's also appropriate to introduce the knight first as well, because of course, as Chaucer in the introduction talked about how, you know, the springtime has come, and as nature grows and the weather gets warmer, it's a perfect time for a pilgrimage. And of course, here's the other thing too, and, you know, let's refer back to Final Fantasy X. You know, a pilgrimage A pilgrimage may seem like, oh, it's a nice little walk from like holy place to holy place. It's like, no, a pilgrimage is super dangerous. You know, there could be bandits, there would be people who may oppose your beliefs or and whatnot. And so a pilgrimage was a very dangerous thing. But the night is kind of interesting to bring in right away when you're talking about like a pilgrimage that has like 30 people going on it. Is that the knight is also kind of like the security of the group as they travel. Because of course the knight is the one who's most experienced with fighting. Although, as we introduce other characters, this may not necessarily be true. But the knight, if he's fought several battles, he must be experienced enough to protect the traveling group. And so, if this guy's also your main security, you might want to speak about him relatively positively, right? Because, you know, if there is a bandit attack on the traveling group, you kind of want to you kind of want the knight to be motivated to save your ass. It just kind of makes sense. And so, with that said, you know, Chaucer is kind of like puffing up the knight and making him look like better than he may actually be. But to be fair, like if you want to live, you're gonna speak about the people who could protect you relatively positively. You don't want to be like those jaded guards in like an Octopath Traveler, right? The guys are just so jaded that like no wonder they become abusive, and of course that's the problem of like the guard work in modern day. But you get the idea. You want to treat military relatively kindly because, you know, they are the people that could potentially kick your ass too. So I do not want to be on the receiving end of a knight's blade. And Chaucer probably had that in mind as he was talking about like the knight and how noble he is and how good he is, and this upstanding like Christian person, even though he's like not part of the religious group, he's not part of the clergy or anything like that. Another thing that's neat to notice is that like the knight is he's a bit of a veteran, and I think Chaucer respects that as well. You know, a whole thank you for your service kind of thing. When he points out that the knight has like a rust, like his armor's a bit rusted. But I guess there's an interesting thing to that when like he points out the knight's armor is kind of rusted, because it shows that he's humble as well. Because of course, you know, if he's nobility and he's probably rich, he could probably just easily buy like a new set. But instead he just wears like his older armor that kind of shows that like, yeah, I've been through shit. And that calls for its own level of respect. Next we have the squire. A squire, for those of you who don't know what that is like an apprentice of a knight. That's the easiest way to summarize what a squire is an apprentice of a knight. And of course in this case it makes sense because like he's also this squire is also the knight's son. And so he would naturally be a squire. Because of course there's other ways to become a squire. Some people like children of merchants' families can become knights if they get accepted into like a noble house and train up as a knight. Ignatz from Fire Emblem Three Houses is an example of this. He's from a merchant family, but because like his older brother's going to inherit the business, we might as well make our second son useful. So let's send him off to military school and have him train up to be a knight. And so he would start out as a squire, and that's kind of the whole point of the academy in like Fodlan, is that kind of idea. And so this squire is funny because he's a contrast to his dad. So his dad is like a very humble man and very like minimalist may not be the right word, but like for instance he keeps his like older rusted armor. You know, he's not like fancily dressed or anything like that. He's just an old knight that wants to go pray at the church. The big church anyway in Canterbury. and so he's like a much more humbler man. Whereas like this younger guy, he's kind of like, well, I mean, to be fair, he's like 20, as Chaucer points out. Yes, I will refer to like the narrator as Chaucer. As Chaucer points out, he's like 20 years old, and so like, you know, he's at that prime of his life. He wants to show he wants to show off his skill, make himself look good, you know, in your youth. And as his mommy probably told him, you don't get a second chance to make a good first impression. And so he wants to make good first impressions wherever he goes. And so he dresses nicely, and he's got a good look to him. He's got good hair. And then, of course, he's also a bit of a... He's got a little bit of the... what do you call it? The warrior scholar aspect to him. So you're probably wondering what the heck I mean by like the warrior scholar. I mean, it's kind of obvious in the wording. But the warrior scholar was a tradition in a lot of like stories. And of course people would try to emulate this in real life because it makes you look way more awesome. And the warrior scholar was the person that like, they were a master of both the arts as well as combat. And the connection of them is that combat is meant to be destructive, but the arts is about creativity. And so the warrior scholar is the harmony of those two things. You know, he's not just like some barbarian who just goes around cracking skulls. You know, he's not just the muscle head of the group. The warrior scholar he's versed in both. And there's a tie-in of his destructive occupation, but his desire for creativity. And that's the whole warrior scholar. I mean, this is a thing that's all over fiction because, of course, the warrior scholar is someone to be admired. You know, there's a beauty to a person who desires to help people and create things and build and make poetry and stuff like that. But at the same time, he's like awesome enough to like kick some ass when he needs to. I mean, the modern day. The easiest example of our modern day warrior scholar is Batman. So Batman is like a genius. He's like the world's greatest detective. But apparently he's also so smart that he can create weapons that can fight superhumans. And so he's like mega badass because he can fight superhumans even though he himself isn't one per se. But Batman is the easiest example of like the warrior scholar. And so there's a high attraction to the warrior scholar. Batman being case in point. I mean, Batman is one of the most recognizable characters in all of fiction because of that warrior scholar aspect of him is very attractive. And it shows that like he's very complex as a character. Because of course, you know, the whole I'm Batman, vengeance, oh my parents were shot in a back alley. But at the same time he wants to help people. He shows compassion, and he's all about helping the little guy, because that's who Batman is. And so, because of course his whole helping the little guy is that he doesn't want people. He wishes that no one else would have to live through the trauma he had to. And so, there's a beauty in a person like that, and that's all over fiction. You like tons of anime heroes have that warrior scholar, because of course like at the same time, I mean from an audience perspective, it's you want a character that has interest to him even though he's like super strong. You know, you can't just have a guy going around just like beating up people and then he doesn't do much else. The scholar side of him shows that he has interest in other things and he is capable of displaying acts of beauty, which adds to their attraction. And you think of like, you know, your isekai that has like well, isekais are not the best example because a lot of the guys end up starting out as like bumbling losers, and then they just get Mary sued into having like greatness, which I think like a good example. Of a warrior scholar in like anime. I mean, there's a lot of them, but I'm trying to think of like a good one. So what's a good example of one that isn't like. Okay, I'll show you an example that's not that great, and then we'll try and build off from there. So like Ryu from Street Fighter is kind of like an okay example. He doesn't have that scholar part to him all that much, but there is that philosophical dynamic of like him dealing with his dark side. And so the scholar side of Ryu is his desire to uphold, the teachings of Goken. And so Ryu, he learns to be, peaceful and be at peace with himself, even though like there is a bit of vengeance in him to defeat Akuma, who killed Goken. And so but Ryu doesn't have a lot more outside of that from like the scholar side. Even though we know he's like a badass warrior, he's like one of the best fighters in his world. Another example of a, like once again, like I might have to go back to like talk about Batman being the warrior scholar, but Noah from Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is a good example. He's a very smart, well-learned person. And I mean, he has to build like a fair amount of strategy for the team. Like even though, and he contrasts Taion a bit. That's actually why him and Taion get along, because they're both like the strategists of their groups. But of course, like Taion is like he's like a mage kind of character, so he's like the bookworm archetype. But Noah has that more like warrior scholar, because he's a fighter, but he's also like the strategist of the team. And so there's a high level of admiration for him compared to like other characters, which is why Noah actually works really well as like a protagonist. And what makes him work so much better than Shulk or Rex from the other Xenoblade games, Noah has that warrior scholar dimension to him that the other two do not. Because Shulk is more of the young hero story. He's not the warrior scholar. He's the young hero. The one who's... talk about Shulk, by the way. Shulk is the young hero. He's thrust into adventure. And that's its own kind of like fun story to tell. I mean, that's the Luke Skywalker story. And so Shulk is pushed into adventure because, the Mechons attack his colony and Fiora gets stabbed and, he thinks she's, he sees her die and he goes on his quest for revenge. And so that pushes him to adventure. Rex is a little different. Rex is, he's kind of strung along into the adventure. He also has a push into adventure, but really it's more about the story's more about Mithra than it is about him. And so Rex doesn't have a warrior scholar to him either, because he's neither. He's not a warrior, nor is he a scholar. He's just some kid who wants to get by with salvaging in his life. He just gets pulled into this larger adventure because he has a bond with Mithra. And so Mithra basically has the adventure, the growing up adventure, and Rex grows up with her. That's kind of the story of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. But Noah has a warrior scholar aspect to him, that he's part of a war culture, but he has a desire to make a better life. And there's an admiration to him that the other two don't have. And that's why I really like Noah compared to the other protagonists. If you watch my Xenoblade Chronicles Let's Play, which yes, there is a playlist on the channel, you should definitely check it out. But if you watch my Xenoblade Chronicles 3 playthrough, and at the end of the game I did mention that like what I liked about him quite a bit was that he has... you see him and his desire to make the world a better place. And that's the scholar coming out of him. Even though he's also the warrior, because he lives in a war culture. And so, the warrior scholar is always like a character that you kind of want to look up to. Especially if they're young. So that's another reason why like Noah works so well. Because he's also young and a warrior scholar. And so going to this squire, he kind of he's aspiring to be that. And that's a very attractive thing, and that's kind of also how like young men would attract a woman in their life, by being that warrior scholar. You have to have that balance of being like a tough guy and being able to like fight and protect. But you also have to be smart. You have to show wisdom in your actions. And that's the other thing too that makes the warrior scholar interesting, is that yes, they use violence at times, but there's a wisdom to it. It's not just like, you know, big meathead beats up people because it's fun to bust heads. The warrior scholar has a lot more nuance, and there's a wisdom to that, and that's also attractive in its own way. Next we have the yeoman, and the yeoman is basically like Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, and so he's like a man of the wild. He works in like nature, I guess you could say, and he works at like a forest, and you think of like a forest guard. That's basically what a yeoman is. And Aragorn from Lord of the Rings is kind of like that. He starts out that way until he accepts his destiny as like he's supposed to be the king of Gondor. Oh, spoilers by the way, for, you know, a super old ass book. But Aragorn is kind of like a ranger, or the yeoman. And what kind of makes the yeoman different from the knights is that the yeoman, he's kind of shown to be like a master of his environment, kind of like a ninja. And so in Lord of the Rings, like Aragorn's able to like track where a bunch of orcs took Pippin and Merry in the Two Towers. Well, after the hobbits got abducted at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. And then Aragorn starts tracking where the orcs took Merry and Pippin. And it's because he has a close connection with nature. And that's kind of the idea of the yeoman. So the knight is all about like, you know, having the big weapons and you know, dominating enemies with like raw strength. But a yeoman is more about like mastering the environment and using like the elements and nature to your advantage. You think of like how Robin Hood is able to like outmaneuver the sheriff, is because like Robin Hood and his guys have like mastered traveling in forests, because they live in one for starters. And so anytime there's, you know, they do all their ambushing through forests, and of course that's kind of like a common trope in like a lot of stories where like, you know, you have a bunch of like woodsmen, you have yeomen like Robin, like you know, hang around in a forest, and they use the terrain to their advantage. Jet from Avatar: The Last Airbender and his guys, you know, they're obviously inspired by Peter Pan and the Lost Boys as well as Robin Hood. And so they're the difference between them and the knights, which I guess in Atla would be like benders, is that they use the elements and they use their surroundings and their understanding of their surroundings to fight people who have like magic powers, right? And so there's an interest in them as well, and that's why people like yeoman characters, because it's like pretty badass when like you can just use your surroundings to like outmaneuver powerful enemies. And so this yeoman, he's kind of like, he's also the archer of the group too. And so, you know, you think of like your typical fantasy story where like the archer also has to be pretty sharp, and he can see things from far away because he has to be able to, you know, shoot stuff that's far away. Kind of their whole shtick. And so the yeoman is also super important on the pilgrimage, because just like the knight, he's the main form of security, and his job, the yeoman's job, is to, you know, to spot any danger if the traveling group may run into any, because you never know, you may run into bandits. And so, with that said, you know, with the knight, the squire, and the yeoman being like the caravan's security, one, it makes sense that Chaucer would talk about them first, and he would also talk about them positively, because, you know, these are the people that are protecting you, and so you should be respectful to them in their craft. All right. Now, for the more interesting part of the introductions. We begin with a nun, a prioress who smiled in an unaffected and quiet way. Her greatest oath was only, by Saint Loy. Her name was Madame Eglantine. She sang the divine service prettily, becomingly intoned through the nose. She spoke French elegantly and well, but with a Stratford-at-Bow accent. So basically she speaks French, but she has like a heavy, like, clearly you're not French accent. For she did not know the French of Paris. At table she showed her good breed at every point. She never let a crumb fall from her mouth, or wetted her fingers by dipping them too deeply into the sauce. And when she lifted the food to her lip, she took care not to spill a single drop onto her breast. Etiquette was her passion. So scrumptiously did she wipe her upper lip that no spot of grease was to be seen in the cup after she had drunk from it. And when she ate, she reached daintily for her food. Indeed, she was most gay, pleasant, and friendly. She took pains to imitate courtly behavior and cultivate a dignified bearing, so as to be thought a person deserving of respect. Speaking of her sensibility, she was so tender-hearted and compassionate that she would weep whenever she saw a mouse caught in a trap, especially if it was bleeding or dead. She kept a number of little dogs whom she fed on roast meat, milk, and the best bread. But if only one of them died of something, or someone took a stick to it, she would cry bitterly, for with her all was sensitivity and tender-heartedness. Her wimple was becomingly pleated, her nose well-shaped, her eyes grey as glass, her mouth small, but soft and red. Certainly she had a fine forehead, I dare say among a span of breadth, for indeed there was nothing diminutive about her. I noticed that she wore a most elegant cloak. On her arm she carried a rosary of small coral beads interspersed, had inscribed upon it a crowned A, and underneath, Amor Victi Omnia, or Love Conquers All. That's what that means. With her she had another nun, her chaplain, and 3 priests. Okay, so I'll do a little quick bit with each person. We'll see how long this stream takes me. It may take me like 3 hours just to do the introduction at this rate. But so I'll try and speed run it. And I can always talk more about these people as we get to their short stories. But basically this nun. Now, what's interesting about the nun, we're just going to point out like the one standout thing, and that's towards the end, where Chaucer points out that like, if you actually look at her carefully, like she wears a really nice garment, she has nice makeup on, and what else does she have? Like, she has like a brooch with like a Love Conquers All, and she has like some nice jewelry on. And so, what's interesting here is that she's supposed to be a nun. Now, you think of like, when I say the word nun, what's the first thing you think of, right? You think of like, oh, I don't know, some young girl in like a church who just wears like a monochromatic black robe, basically, with like the little white bits. You know, you think of like, what's a good example? In Game of Thrones, you know, the virgin maids of the temple there, and you know, they just have like very bland looking clothes, and they just have their little headdress, very simple, and they're very unassuming, because you know the whole idea when people think of like nuns living in a monastery kind of thing is that they're all about like the minimalism and so they don't have elaborate clothing and stuff like that. It's just black outfit with little white bits on it. That's it. You don't think much else. But the nun here, she has like, you know, she's got some jewelry on her. She's got a nice lipstick on. You know, she's got a little bit more to her than what you would expect of a nun. And so Chaucer pointing this out, and we'll get to this more when we get to her story, is that there's more to her than meets the eye. You know, she may not be the simple church girl you expect. You know, there's more to her than what you see. And that's what Chaucer's kind of pointing out. And then, of course, there's the funny thing where, like, she has another nun with her, as well as, like, 3 priests with her. And so she appears to also be, like, a person of authority. So this nun may not just be a simple nun. Alright, moving on to the next person. There was a remarkably fine-looking monk who acted as a state steward to his monastery, and he loved hunting. A manly man, well fitted to be an abbot. Excuse me. He kept plenty of fine horses in his stable, and when he went out riding, people could hear the bells of his bridle jingling in the whistling wind, as clear and loud as the chapel bell of the small convent of which he was the head. Because the rule of St. Maur or of St. Benedict was old-fashioned and somewhat strict, this monk neglected the old precepts and followed the modern custom. He did not give 2 pins for the text which says hunters cannot be holy men, or that a monk who is heedless of his rule, that is to say, a monk out of his cloister, is like a fish out of water. In his view, this saying was not worth a bean, and I told him his opinion was sound. Why should he study and addle his wits with everlasting poring over a book in cloisters, or work with his hands, or toil as St. Augustine commanded? He is the world to be... I'll flip the page here. He is the world... Sorry. How is the world to be served? Let St. Augustine keep his hard labor for himself. Therefore the monk, whose whole pleasure lay in riding and hunting, remained a hard rider and kept grave hounds swift as birds. I saw that his sleeves were edged with costly grey fur, the finest in the land. He had an elaborate golden brooch, and a love knot at the larger end of his fastened hood beneath his chin. His bald head shone like glass, and so did his face, as it had been anointed. He was a plump and personably dignitary, with prominent, restless eyes, which sparkled like fire beneath a pot. His boots were supple, and his horse is in perfect condition. To be sure, he was a fine-looking prelate, no pale and wasting ghost. His favorite dish was a fat roast swan. The horse he rode was as brown as a berry. Okay, so we just talked about how the nun is kind of like, there's more to her than what meets the eye. This monk guy, on the other hand, is pretty interesting because he's like, once again, you look at this guy and he's nothing like what you would think of like a monk. So what do you think of a monk? You think Friar Tuck. Well, Friar Tuck is a terrible example because more on that later. But basically you think of like, you know, your typical like pastor that just like, you know, he just goes up on Sunday morning, gives a sermon, and then there's not much else to him. You don't know much about his personal life or anything like that. Although most pastors today are not like this monk. You know, they don't, or I guess you could say more pastors today are like this monk because you would think like a pastor is just like some boring guy who just reads the Bible to you. But as soon as you start talking, you take a second look at them and you start talking to them and you realize there's a lot more to this guy. And it's not what I think a pastor would be. I'll tell a funny story. It's actually how I got to know my buddy Baruka. who has his own YouTube channel, and I hang out on his streams. But at the time when I met him, I was still in my younger years of like aspiring to be a pastor. I know that sounds like I'm not doing that now, but let's just say it has not like. I know it sounds so terrible to say this, but you know, with the amount of hardship I've been facing, it's not easy to want to get back into pastoring, not in a formal sense. I mean, that's why this channel exists, is so that I can kind of still read the gospel to people, but at the same time, like I've just conceded that like, oh, you won't see me working in the church anytime soon, unless like a miracle from God happens, and then like, somebody wants me pastoring their church. Like, I want that guy. I want this guy. I want this guy I see on camera here. I want this guy. Unless some guy sees that and then, like, has you just pastoring, like, a church all of a sudden. I don't see it happening. And anyway, that's me now. But back when I met Burke, I was much more, like, wide-eyed, and I was all like, I'm an aspiring pastor. And people were a little taken aback when I mentioned that. I mean, a lot of people still are a little taken aback when I tell them I'm a pastor. Because they're like, oh shit, right? Like, you're a pastor? Like, I would not have thought that when I looked at you. I mean, for instance, like, okay, like when I was hanging out with my buddy Burke, it's like a video game stream, we're talking Fire Emblem, and we're talking like other video games, and then like all of a sudden I was like, yeah, I'm a pastor, and I was like, oh, right? Because a lot of people have that image in their head that like a pastor is like this very stoic, doesn't do much else other than like preach the Bible on a Sunday morning, and he doesn't do much else, which is massively ignorant and arrogant, but that's besides the point. Of course, no thanks to media, because of course a lot of TV shows show pastors as being like bland in their personality. But people are a little taken aback. It's like, yes, I have a personality. Like most people, I have a personality. And so this monk is kind of like that. Excuse me. This monk is kind of like that. He has a personality. He likes the outdoors. He likes hunting. He likes going out. Of course, that conflicts with his duties as a monk, that he's supposed to be taking care of a parish. He's supposed to be being a spiritual guide for people. Even though his hobbies are all about him being outdoors, not in the confession booth. And then of course, like, this guy, he's a pretty big guy too, and and there's something that like I mentioned earlier, that the knight, even though he's like the veteran military guy, it's not like he's the only guard they have, because it looks like this monk here, if they were attacked by bandits, this monk would be ready to throw fists. He's got guard dogs too, apparently. So like, this monk is clearly like someone you also don't want to cross in a fight, because even though he may just look like some religious guy, nah, he looks like he's also ready to mess you up. Alright, moving on. A begging friar who was there, a gay, pleasant limiter. A limiter, by the way, is like a guy who's like early in his church duties. He's a new friar, basically. With an imposing presence, nobody in all the four orders was so adept with flattery and tittle-tattle. He had to pay for the marriages of good young women. Still, he was a noble pillar of his order. He was well liked and on easy terms with the rich landowners, everywhere in the district in which he begged, and also with the wealthy townswomen, for he was a licentiate of his order and qualified, or so he said, to hear confession of graver sins than parish priests were allowed to absolve. He heard confession sweetly, and his absolution was pleasant. When he was sure of a good thank offering, he was an easy man in giving penance. For if a man gave generously to a poor order, it is a sign he has been well shriven. Once a man opened his purse strings, the friar could vouch for it that he was penitent. For many people, though truly remorseful, are so hardened they cannot weep. Therefore, instead of prayers and tears, people might as well give money to the poor friars. The pockets of his hood were always stuffed with knives and pins to give to young women. And he certainly had a pleasant voice. He could sing and play the fiddle well, and was a champion ballad singer. His neck was white as a lily, but for all that he was as strong as a prize fighter. In every town he knew all the taverns and innkeepers, and barmaids better than the lepers and beggars. For it hardly befitted a man of his ability and distinction to mix with diseased lepers. It is not seemly, and gets a man nowhere, to have dealings with rabble of that type, but only with merchants and the rich. Above all, whenever profit might be had, he offered his services with polite submission. Nowhere would you find such a capable man. He was the best beggar in his friary. He paid a fixed fee for his district in which he begged. None of his brethren poached on his preserves. Even if a widow had no shoes, he had only begun saying the first words of the Gospel of St. John in his pleasant voice, and he'd get at least a sixpence out of her before he left. But he made his biggest profits on the side. He would romp about like a puppy on settling days, when he was on great help as an arbiter. For on those occasions he did not appear like some poor cloistered student in threadbare vestment like a master of divinity or the Pope. His outer cloak was a double worsted, as rounded as a bell just out of his mound. He lisped a little, and this was a mannerism to make his English sound attractive. Speaking with a lisp to sound attractive. I'm a little suspect on that. And when he played the harp and had finished his song, his eyes twinkled in his head like stars on a frosty night. This excellent friar was called Hubert. Okay, so the last of this little group, because we move into a third category of people, but I guess we'll call the nun, the monk, and the friar. We'll call them what do we call them? I guess the way to call them is the indulgent servants. So as religious people, as like in their religious roles, like nuns, monks, and friars, are supposed to be servants of the people. But it's pretty clear that these guys are actually kind of self-indulgent. So the nun has her whole thing on like being, let's just say she may be a nun, but let's just say she's a woman too. Let's go with that. And so she shows her interest in like typical women desires, like fashion, and being perceived as beautiful and stuff like that. You know, she doesn't just settle for the Cinderella vibe thing like Mercedes from Three Houses. You know, she's not like that. She's a little bit more indulgent than that. And then the monk, you know, he's a guy who loves the outdoors. Sure, he works inside some old crusty church building, but his heart is really in the outdoors and being a hunter. You know, probably grew up a hunter, and that was always his life. And so just because he, you know, works in a church, that didn't change. And so he's indulgent of that. And finally, we have the flirt, you know, and even though he's supposed to be like a holy man, you know, he lets his, you know, his flirty, his flirtations, you know, get the better of him and guide his way, if you will. And so, you know, he'd rather be charming women than like taking care of the poor. Which of course, you know, when you say the indulgent servant, there's that paradox, because they're supposed to help others. but they're more self-interested. Of course, now you see there's a little bit of cynicism, if you will, with Chaucer's writing. So the first three religious people he brings up, because there's more of them to come, but the first religious person he brings up, there's a cynicism toward them, because they're supposed to be holy people, but there's other things that make you question that too, let's just say. And so Chaucer's cynicism is kind of showing, because he may not have the highest opinion of these religious folk, even though they're going on a pilgrimage to a religious holy site. Something is amiss. Let's just go with that. Alright, moving on. Now there was a merchant with a forked beard who rode seated on a high saddle, wearing a many-colored dress, boots fastened with neat handsome clasp, and upon his head a Flanders beaver hat. He gave out his opinions with great pomposity, and never stopped talking about the increase of his profits. Basically, he talks a lot and he's very boastful about it. That he thinks he's awesome because he makes a lot of money. Which, to be fair, I guess if you're successful, that does make you awesome. In his view, the high seas between Harwich and Holland should be cleared of pirates at all costs. He was an expert at the exchange of currency. This worthy citizen used his head to the best advantage, conducting his money-lending and other financial transactions in a dignified manner. None guessed he was in debt. He really was a most estimable man. But to tell the truth, his name escapes me. Now there was a scholar from Oxford who had long been studying logic. His horse was as lean as a rake, and I give you my word that he himself was no fatter, but looked both melancholy and hollow-cheeked, as he had not yet found himself a benefice, and was too unworldly to take secular employment. His overcoat was pretty threadbare, for he preferred his library of Aristotle's philosophical works, bound in black calf and red sheepskin. At the head of his bed. Wow, I messed that up. Okay. He preferred his library of Aristotle's philosophical works, bound in black calf and red sheepskin, at the head of his bed. To fine clothes, the fiddle and psalter. Yet, for all his philosophy and science, he had but little gold in his coffer. He spent everything he could get from his friends on books and learning, and in return prayed assiduously for the souls who gave him the money to pursue his studies. Learning was his whole solicitude and care. He never spoke a word more than necessary, and then it was with due formality and respect, brief and to the point, and lofty in theme. His conversation was eloquent with goodness and virtue. He was as glad to learn as to teach. A sage and cautious sergeant at law, a well-known... Okay, that's the next guy, actually. So, we just had a merchant, and we just had a scholar. And the scholar, he's your typical, skinny nerd, probably wears, big dorky glasses, loves learning, all he cares about is learning, doesn't do much else. He's broke because he's just buying whatever books he can get his hands on. And so, he's that guy. So basically, I'm trying to think of a good example. Gohan from Dragon Ball, Except Gohan's like a warrior too, so he doesn't quite count. But like, you know that nerdy look that Gohan has? Yeah, that's the scholar. He's a nerd. Big fat bona fide nerd. That's what he is. Alright, continuing on. A sage and cautious sergeant at law, a well-known figure at the portico of St. Paul's where the lawyers met. Basically, he's a lawyer. Was also present. He was a man of excellent parts, discreet and of great distinction. Or so he seemed, for he spoke with such wisdom. He had often acted as judge of the assize by the king's letter, and had authority to hear all types of cases. His skill and great reputation earned him many fees and robes given in lieu of money. Nowhere was there a better conveyancer. He could untie any entail and get unrestricted possession of the property, while his conveyances were never invalidated. There was no busier a man anywhere, and yet he seemed busier than he was. He could quote precisely all the cases and judgments since the conquest, besides which he could compose and draw up a deed so that none could fault it. He knew all the statutes word for word. He was dressed simply in a party-colored coat, girded by a silk belt with narrow stripes. And I'll say nothing else of his appearance. So, lawyer, knows his law cases. His companion was a franklin, with a ruddy complexion and daisy-white beard, who was more than partial to a drink and sops and wine early in the morning. It was always his custom to live well, for he was a true son of Epicurus, who held the opinion that only real happiness lies in sensual pleasures. The franklin kept up a magnificent establishment, where he was as famous for hospitality as St. Julian. The quality of his bread and wine never varied. His cellar was unsurpassed, and his house never lacked food, in such plenty that in his house it seemed to snow, food and drink and every kind of delicacy one can think of. Different dishes were served according to the season of the year. An abundance of fat partridges filled his coop, while his fish ponds were plentiful, stocked with bream and pike. His cook found himself in trouble if the sauce was not sharp and piquant, or if he were to be caught unprepared. The hall table was kept laid and ready, and the livelong day this franklin presided at the sessions of justices of the peace, and was often member of Parliament for the shire. A dagger and a silk purse hung from his belt, which was white as milk. He had been sheriff and auditor of his country, and nowhere would you find a better specimen than the landed gentry. Okay, so Franklin is basically, I guess you could say he's like a guild leader. In that, like, okay, so you have like a bunch of like a certain trade, and let's say, let's say, you had a bunch of traders of, well, I guess in this guy's case, he was like what was he a trader of? Trying to see. He might be like a wine distributor or something. He distributes some kind of delicacy. So it's probably wine or something. So, as a franklin of wine, what that would mean is that, like, let's say there's a bunch of wine sellers. People who sold wine. Not places where you store wine. I can see where you'd be confused. A bunch of, like, wine merchants. And a franklin, he oversees all of them. And kind of is the one that says, like, alright, this is how much wine is going for. And I don't want you guys doing funky stuff to, like, bump prices or whatever. And so, in a way, he's like the market control. And so, people like that tend to be like pretty high end because they're like, you know, they're leaders of entire like trade groups, and so there would be Franklins for different industries. And so, the assumption is that since he's a Franklin of like probably wine trading, that probably puts him as like super wealthy, and that's why he's got like tons of meat and food in his house, and he's never short on stuff in his house because he's the leader of like a wine tycoon. So, you know, that's where the fat money is. Continuing on, among the rest were a haberdasher, a hat maker. A haberdasher is a hat maker. A carpenter, self-explanatory. A weaver, also self-explanatory. A dyer, a person who deals with like clothes dye. And a tapestry maker. All dressed in uniform, livery belonging to a rich and honorable guild. Their apparel was new and freshly trimmed. Their knives were not dipped with brass, but finely mounted with wrought silver to match their belts and purses. Each seemed a proper burgess worth of a place on the dais of a guild hall, and every one of them had the ability and judgment, besides sufficient property and income, to become an alderman. So to raise up the ranks, basically. In this they would have the hearty assent of their wives, else the ladies would certainly be much to blame. For it's very pleasant to be called madam, and take precedence at church festivals, and have one's mantle carried in state. And these these guild men, they took a cook with them for the occasion, to boil chickens with marrow bones, tart-flavored powder, and spice. Well did he know the taste of London ale. He knew how to roast, fry, seethe, broil, make soup, and bake pies. But it was the greatest pity, so I thought, that he got an ulcer on his shin, for he made chicken pudding with the best of 'em. I mean, you gotta have, every traveling group needs a cook with them, just in case you need to camp, and someone's gotta cook for everybody else. Next we have a sea captain, whose house was in the West Country, and was also there. As far as I can tell, he came from Dartmouth. He rode after a fashion, upon a farmhouse, and wore a gown of coarse serge, reaching to the knee. And under his arm he carried a dagger slung from lanyard around his neck. The hot summer had tanned him brown, and he was certainly a bit of a lad, for he had lifted many a mount of wine from Bordeaux, while the merchants were napping. He had no time for finer feelings. If he fought and got the upper hand, he threw his prisoners overboard and sent them home by water to wherever they came from. From Hull to Cartagena, there was none to match his seamanship in calculating tides, currents, and the hazards around him, or his knowledge of harbors, navigation, and the changes of the moon. He was a shrewd and hardy adventurer. His beard had been shaken in many a storm. He knew every harbor there was from Gotland to Cape Finisterre, and every inlet of Brittany and Spain. The name of his ship was the Magdalene. Okay, so I guess not exactly a military guy, but an adventurer. And as you notice, we kind of been talking about like these kind of middle class people. So we had the nobility with the knight, squire, and yeoman. Yeoman's not exactly nobility, but yeomen work all the time with nobility, so they kind of just kind of fit in, I guess. Then we had a couple clergy people, like a non-monk and friar. Then we have a bunch of like working class people. Of course, some of them weren't working class. They're like the millionaires of the group, but you get the point. They're like they're standard and they're working people. They're part of the marketplace. And then we have this sea captain who's an adventurer hanging out with them. And so these guys represent like the relatively average, the normal people that you run into in society. They're not part of the military, so they're not serving like a particular function within the country. And they're not like the religious groups, which you would associate with like, how do I put this? You would associate with them with like I guess it's different from the world today. So I was about to say like they're part of like the societal trenders, but of course nowadays it's not set up by like religious organizations. It's done by hive minding on the internet, which I guess is its own type of religion, right? Because that's how religions work. People gather together, they think a certain way, and then they create innovation from that. But anyway, and now we have this adventurer, the sea captain. Another adventurer is a doctor of medicine accompanied us. There was none to touch him in matters of medicine and surgery. I mean, you gotta have your medic. For he was well grounded in astronomy. His astrological knowledge enabled him to select the most favorable hour to administer remedies to his patients. Sounds like a naturopath rather than a doctor, but whatever. And he was skilled in calculating the propitious moment to make talismans for his clients. So yeah, he's one of those kind of doctors. He could diagnose every kind of disease and say in what organ and from which of the four humors, the hot, the cold, the wet, or the dry, the distemper arose. He was a model practitioner. Once he had detected the root of the trouble, he gave the sick man his medicine there and then, for he had his apothecaries ready at hand to send him drugs and syrups. In this way, each made a profit for the other. Their partnership was not new. The doctor was well versed in the ancient medical authors. Asclepius, a bunch of Greek names here, so bear with me here. Dioscorides, Dioscorides, that's how you say that. Rufus, Halley, Galen, Seraphion, Rhazes, Avicenna, Averroes, Constantine, Bernard, Gaddisden, and Gilbert. I like how the last guy is like a most simple name. Thank God. In his own diet he was moderate. It contained nothing superfluous, but only what was nourishable and digestible. He seldom read the Bible. The cloths he was dressed in were blood red and grey blue, lined with fine silk and taffeta. Yet he was no free spender, but laid by whatever he earned from the plague. In medicine, gold is the great restorative, and therefore he was particularly fond of it. So basically a doctor who takes advantage of like people not knowing stuff. I mean, that's one of the dangerous things about like dealing with apothecaries is that like, I mean, you have to take their word for it when they talk about medical stuff, because if you're just some person working a farm, you don't know, but you have to just trust the doctor. Well, of course, there's a lot of modern stories about how, like, some of these doctors can be, like, huge scammers and just take advantage of people's, like, lack of knowledge. But it is what it is. Now, there among us was a worthy wife from near Bath. So Bath is a place, by the way. The wife of Bath is what we'll call her. But she was a bit deaf, which was a pity. At cloth making, she beat even the weavers of Ypres and Ghent. There was not a woman in her parish who dared go in front of her when she went to the offertory. If anybody did, you may be sure it put her on such a rage she was out of all patience. Her kerchiefs were one of the finest texture. I dare say those she wore upon her head on Sundays weighed 10 pounds. Her stockings were of the finest scarlet, tightly drawn up above glossy new shoes. Her face was bold, handsome, and florid. She had been a respectable woman all her life, having married 5 husbands in church, apart from other lovers in youth, of which there is no need to speak at present. She had visited Jerusalem 3 times, and crossed many foreign rivers. She had been to Rome, Boulogne, the shrine of St. James of Compostela in Galicia, and Cologne. So she knew a lot about traveling around. The truth is, she was gap-toothed. She rode comfortably upon an ambling horse, her head well covered with a wimple, and a hat the size of a shield or buckler. An outer skirt covered her grey hips, while on her feet she wore a pair of sharp spurs. In company she laughed and rattled away. No doubt she knew all the cures for love. For that game she was past mistress. So, the wife of Bath. How do I put this? Although not the best parallel, because I don't think an OnlyFans girl would go to church, but she's basically your OnlyFans girl. That's her. Yeah, she's that one, isn't she? Taking dudes' monies and doing all kinds of weird crap with it. Just sucking money from dudes all over the internet. Yeah, that sounds like the wife of Bath would fit in right in with them. Now with us was a good religious man, a poor parson, but rich in holy thoughts and acts. He was a learned man, a scholar who truly preached Christ's gospel and taught his parishioners devoutly. Benign, hard-working, and patient in adversity, as had often been put to the test. He was loath to excommunicate those who failed to pay their tithe. To tell the truth, he would rather give to the poor of his parish who had been offered him by the rich, or from his own pocket, for he managed to live on very little. Wide as was his parish, with houses few and far between, neither rain nor thunder, nor sickness, nor misfortune stopped him from going on foot, staff in hand, to visit the most distant parishioners. High or low, to his flock he set his noble example. First he practiced, then he preached. This was a precept he had taken from the gospel, and if he added this proverb, if gold can rust, what will iron do? For if the priest in whom we trust be rotten, no wonder an ordinary man corrupts. Let priests take note. Shame it is to see the shepherd covered in dung, while his sheep are clean. It's for the priest to set his flock the example of a spotless life. He did not farm his benefice and leave his sheep to flounder in the mud while he ran off to St. Paul's in London to seek some easy living, such as a chantry, where he would be paid to sing masses for the souls of the dead, or a chaplaincy in one of the guilds, but dwelt at home and kept watch over the flock, so that it was not harmed by the wolf. He was a shepherd, not a priest for hire. And although he was saintly and virtuous, he did not despise sinners. His manner of speaking was neither distant nor severe. On the contrary, he was considerate and benign in his guidance. His endeavor was to lead folk to heaven, and by example of a good life. Yet, if anyone, whatever his rank, proved obstinate he never hesitated to deliver a striking rebuke. I say there was nowhere a better priest. He never looked for ceremony and deference, nor was his conscience of the over-scrumptious and spacious sort. He taught the gospel of Christ and his 12 apostles, but first he followed it himself. Okay, so yeah, if it wasn't obvious, the Parson is, I love this guy. I mean, this guy is like the model character, and you'll definitely see that as we get to his short story. And as a matter of fact, if it also wasn't obvious, I've mentioned this a couple of times on the channel, assuming you can find where I've said them. I mentioned them in like various streams, and I've always like mentioned how I kind of base myself on this guy. You know, he's a simple man. He's a simple man, but he really cares about the people under his care. And you know, he's a learned person, and to him it's about like living, you know, being Christian. You know, what's interesting is he's quite the contrast compared to the first three main religious people that we had. We had the nun, the monk, and the friar, and the Parson's a very clear contrast to them, because where the nun, the monk, and the friar are a little self-indulgent, the indulgent servants, as I called them, the Parson is not like this at all. He's very self-sacrificing. He's appears to be like this model Christian, and you know, of course, to anyone, you know, only the most arrogant would say like, well, I am in fact the model Christian, but you know, I like to think that, like, you know, to really live out the teachings of Christ and to be like him. And I mean, I've mentioned this before, that like, I guess in my devotion of like really trying to live up to like, how would Christ live? By that definition, that makes me a fanatic. But at the same time, you know, when it comes to the teachings of Christ, and you know, to love your neighbor as yourself, and to carry your cross, and to follow Jesus, you know, like, it's a very tall order, and it's also about self-sacrifice, right? When you take up your cross and to bear your cross. And so it's the Parson is that character that, like, yeah, you know, we actually have a guy who models that, as opposed to like these indulgent servants that you don't, you know, you might get that whole impression of like they're supposed to preach something, but there's something off about them. And that's kind of where, like, that's the modern criticism that a lot of people have toward like Christians, is that there's too many people like this, the indulgent servants, but not enough like the Parson, who live out Christ's commands. And you know, I've kind of built this persona, the Streaming Parson, if it wasn't obvious, around this character. And you know, I always like to think that, like, in my life, I'm trying to be that model Christian, to really live out Christ's teachings, because that's how, in my mind, I believe that more people will receive the gospel, because of how you live, not just what you say. And I mean, that's where, like, you know, major cringe moment, but like, you know, a lot of people, when they think of like Christians, they think of like those various like groups. I would say, like, some people would call them fanatics, but I mean, to an extent, everybody is a fanatic of something. So everybody's a fanatic. But you think of like those weird church groups that are like borderline cults. I mean, the Westboro Baptist is an example that people always like to say, of like, oh, you know, Christians are horrible because of people like them. But then you get to like other Christian groups that are more indulgent. And I've told this story a number of times, but I knew quite a few Christians that were pretty indulgent. And me being the fanatic, I guess you could say, I was the one who would be like, no, like, as good Christians, we ought to live this certain way and to not, blend in with the culture in like how on what we think on certain issues. And so, and you guys have heard me in my Bible reading streams. I've had many a hot take that most people surprisingly haven't canceled me for yet, because I hold to like biblical traditionalism, and sure, I can have my weird anime spins on that, but the idea is that like I still follow closely to like what Scripture teaches, as opposed to like some people are too compromising, I guess is the best word for it, and they're more indulgent because of course people are more part of the culture than they are of Christ, and I kind of see myself wanting to be more like this person, and that's why I created the channel, the Streaming Parson. That like, no, I want to be a person who cares for people and care for people so that the gospel can be revealed in people's lives. And I've told this story so many times, but one of the things that as I hang around with like a lot of young people online, and something that's kind of like an oof is that a lot of those young people don't have good spiritual models. Their idea of Christians are only like what they see on TV and what other people tell them, but they don't actually like know many Christians themselves, and especially good ones anyway, that like really emphasize like the virtues that Christ tried to teach us, to love and to serve others. A lot of people don't have those kind of experiences with Christians, so their expectations of Christians are like a bunch of loud mouths that just say gay people go to hell kind of thing. That's what most people's expectation of a Christian is, as opposed to a person who wants to show kindness and compassion as Christ showed to us. And so, that's another reason why I came with like the Streaming Parson name and that persona, because reading the Canterbury Tales and seeing the Parson, and especially when we get to his story much later, you see that like like people need an authentic experience of like someone who lives up to the words of Christ. But unfortunately, that's far in between, because even though like 30%, like I don't know what the percentage is of like people in the United States say they're Christian, but then like what's their extent of their Christian beliefs? Like you go to church once a week, you open your Bible when the pastor talks, close it, put it on the shelf, and don't open it again until like a week later. And so that's, can you really call that Christian? And if most people's experience of Christians are people like that, then that just brings a lot of disservice to what the gospel is all about. And that's about being merciful to others because God was merciful to you. And that's what the Parson kind of embodies. That's kind of how I like to think I live my life. But of course, nobody's perfect. I'm aware of that. And so, and also like, it's hard to compare yourself to like a character in a book, right? And especially one that's so perfect, like the Parson here. But anyway, I know I had the long spiel about him because, like, once again, I mean, this is the Streaming Parson channel. Now you have a much better idea of where I got the inspiration from for the character that I am. Character. I know that sounds like this is not an act, but the persona you see here, the Streaming Parson. Inspiration. Alright, let's move on, because we got quite a number of characters to get through. I'm not going to finish the I might be able to finish the prologue before the stream ends. I know it's a lot longer stream than like I normally would do, but to do this whole introduction requires a lot of like extra exposition from me. So bear with me And thank you for bearing with me for this first stream, because this one is going to be a lot longer. As we get to like the various tales, they take. I'll just kind of read through them as opposed to like needing to talk about all this other, you know, to delve into other aspects. But as we read the tales, we'll just kind of read them. Now with the parson came his brother, a ploughman. Many a load of dung had been carted by his good and faithful labourer, by this good and faithful labourer, who lived in a place in charity with all. For first he loved God with his whole heart, and in good times and in bad. Next he loved his neighbour as himself. He threshed and dug and ditched, and for Christ's love would do as much for any poor fellow without payment. If he could manage it, he paid his tithes on both his crops and the increase of his livestock, fairly and in full. He rode humbly upon a mare and wore a loose labourer's smock. Finally, there was a reeve, a mill. I guess I'll talk about the ploughman a little bit. And another reason why I kind of parallel myself with the parson as well is that my younger brother is very much like this ploughman. At least he kind of was. Not so, I mean, in the former, my brother was like the ploughman, in that my brother is a very hardworking, and he loved that manual labor, and even like for a long time my brother worked in like a job that's like no glory, right? It's just like he drives a truck around, moves stuff around, warehouse work, you know. The people who deal with all the goods you use but never get thanks because you know, you forget that there are people who work in those shitty warehouses, kind of thing. And my brother was he did that for a number of years until he got sick, and so he doesn't do that anymore. But even though the plowman, he just works like a rough labor job, but he's also like a very Christly character. And it's interesting that Chaucer uses direct like scripture ideas. So what's interesting is with the parson, Chaucer relates him with like the people of the Bible, like with Christ and his apostles, and the parson he mirrors the parson to them, which is a tall order to parallel a mere man with Christ himself. But this idea of like the way the parson lived closely to the scriptures, Chaucer makes a point of that he would be just like one of the other like apostles, kind of thing. Even though, you know, if you watch my book of Acts reading streams, you know that the apostles didn't become holier men until much later, you know, after the day of Pentecost. But you know, the parson is paralleled to like the people, whereas the plowman is paralleled with the principles of the Bible, and how appropriate that he uses the Great Commandment for describing the plowman. The plowman may be a simple man, so you give the simplest understanding of the scriptures, and that's the Great Commandment. And what is the Great Commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength, or your body, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Chaucer directly quotes that in regard to the plowman, and so the plowman is parallel with the principle of the law of God. And so, you know, it just kind of gives me like, I don't want to go too much into it now. Maybe we'll do it in a few, you know, if you have questions about it, you can always ask, I guess, and we can always talk about it later, I guess, because I want to get through this introduction. Like, we're already 2 hours in, I'm not done the introduction. But my brother is a lot like that, I guess. I would say that about my brother. And I don't just say that because he's my brother. But, you know, in the last number of years, you know, I may be the pastor, but my brother, you know, he doesn't watch my streams because he hears my voice enough as it is, so he doesn't watch these because he knows he's going to get tired of my voice. So I know he's not watching this. But, you know, I'm sure he already knows this, though, that, like, even though like I may be the pastor, and you know, a holy man in that sense, you know, I hold him to be a better man than me, and I really think that, and I kind of see that parallel with like the parson and the plowman, that the plowman is also this kind of idealized person, and I love how Chaucer kind of keeps it short and simple, that, you know, he just sums up the word of the law of God, love God and love your neighbor, and that's the plowman, and you know, that's all you need to be viewed as like, yeah, you know, you're a man of God, and you know, my brother, he already knows that I think this. I'm sure he does, but I think about him like that too, and I see that parallel here, that like my brother and I are the parson and the plowman, and I don't know, I just want to reminisce a bit on that, because you know, it just shows that like, once again, you know, like the parcel is like this idealized person, right? But then at the same time, to still say that there are people better than you, and more holy than you. You know, I would say that about my brother. I know he'll never watch this, so just that's between you. That'll be between you and me, okay? But the plowman he's a great character as well. But the parson is basically me. Excuse me. All right. Finally, there was a reeve, a miller, a summoner, a pardoner, a manciple, and last of all myself. Now the miller was a great brawny fellow, a big boned, with powerful muscles, which he turned to good account at wrestling matches up and down the land, for he carried off the prize every time. He was thick-set, broad, and muscular. I mean, we just talked about how he was a big guy. There was no door that he couldn't heave off its hinges, or break down by running at it with his head. His beard was as red as a fox or a sow, and wide as a spade at that. Upon the tip of his nose, on the right side, was a wart of which stood a tuft of hair, red as the bristles in a pig's ear. His nostrils were squat and black. At his side he carried a sword and buckler. A great mouth, wide as a furnace door, and his talk was mostly bawdy and vicious. He was a ribald joker and a chatterer, and well did he know all the tricks of his trade, how to filch corn and charge 3 times his proper due. Yet he was honest enough as millers go. He wore a white coat and a blue hood, and led us out of town, lustily blowing and tooting upon the bagpipes. So TLDR, he's that like construction worker guy, you know, that huge ass dude. You're like, oh shit, I never want to fight that guy. That's the miller. He's the huge ass construction worker guy. That's him. Now there was a worthy manciple of one of the Inns of Court, who might have served as a model of carterers and shrewdness in the purchase of provisions, for whether he paid cash or bought on credit, which is weird because that's a very modern idea. He watched prices all the time, so that he always got in first and did good business. Now it is not a remarkable example of God's grace that the wit of an uneducated man like this should outmatch the wisdom of a pack of learned men. His superiors numbered more than 30, and were all erudite and expert in the law. There were a dozen men in his college capable of so managing the rents and land of any peer in England as to enable him, unless he were mad, of course, to live honorably and free of debt upon his income. The answering machine is gonna go off. So let's just give it a minute here. So yeah, the manciple, for those of you who don't know what a manciple is, a manciple is basically, if I were to give a modern parallel, it's like those Twitch streamers that do like their like debate streams, or like they, such a shitty example, but like your bread tubers, you know, guys who just like talk. They just talk on camera, and they give their philosophy and their they just talk philosophy or whatever online, and that's how they make their living. Emancipate was kind of like that. So basically, how it would work in the Middle Ages is that he would be in public squares and whatever, and he would talk about ideas, be entertaining while doing it or whatever, and people would give him money, and he was good at this craft that he could just talk his way into getting money. That was kind of his whole thing, and that can expand. That can go from anything from like, you know, telling a story to people in the streets and people throwing him money, to straight up like laundering money and like gambles and stuff like that, and just talking his way out of getting the best deals out of everything. And that was kind of what a manciple is. And so this guy, this particular manciple was just so good at it that he had become super rich. And that's where I came with like the bread tuber illustration, where like, dude, these guys are like, they make bank. And all they do is just talk in front of a camera. I mean, I wish I was that good, but I guess I'm not. But some of these guys, they can just like talk their way into money. Alright, the Reeve was a slender, choleric man. He shaved his beard as close as it could, and cropped his hair short round the ears. The top of his head was shown in front like a priest. He had long, thin legs like sticks. The calves were invisible. He kept his bins and granaries ably. No auditor could get the better of him. But nothing the drought and rainfall. I'm slurring words now. He could make a good estimate of the yield of his seed and grain. All his master's livestock, sheep, cattle, dairy, pigs, horses, and poultry, was entirely managed by this Reeve. A Reeve is just like a house caretaker, basically, of like the financial part of it. It's like a glorified secretary. Let's go with that. Who had undertaken to render accounts ever since his master was 20 years old. None could prove he was in arrears. He knew every dodge and swindle and every one of the bailiffs, herdsmen, and farm laborers. They feared the Reeve like death itself. He lived in a beautiful house, standing in a meadow, shaded by green trees. At bargaining he was better than his master, and had feathered his nest very comfortably, for he was adroit in putting his master under an obligation by a gift or loan of his own property, thus earning his thanks beside the present of a gown or a hood. As a young man, the Reeve had learned a good trade. He was a skilled workman, a carpenter. This Reeve rode over a sturdy, dapple-gray cob called Scott. So Chaucer remembered the name of the guy's horse. He wore a long blue overcoat, with a rusty sword by his side. The Reeve of whom I speak comes from near the town of Bothwell in Norfolk. He had his coat hitched up by a girdle like a friar, and always rode the hindmost or hindmost of our party. Now among us at the end was a summoner. Oh, I guess I should talk about the Reeve a little bit, although I kind of already did that. So the Reeve is basically like, he oversees like other people's property. He's kind of like what would be a good modern parallel? But he, in a way, is kind of like a glorified secretary. Where like, well, he does more than what a secretary basically does, but basically, um, he would like. Obviously, back in the Middle Ages, you know, you have like a lord, and he has like his property and all his stuff, and it's not like the lord himself keeps track of everything. He's just super wealthy because he has all his stuff, but he usually hires someone to like do the math work for him, of knowing how many of like animals that he has or whatever. And so the reeve would be that person. And this guy, and because he, you know, he manages the household, a manager, that's a good way of wording it, of thinking about like a reeve. As the manager, he would be very, very knowledgeable about, well, all kinds of things. Like he'd be very good at math and reading and stuff like that, because he has to be able to maintain he has to know a lot of information to maintain a house, basically. And so it's kind of one of those like funny things where like, okay, you have like the super rich noble or whatever, but they, of course, like what makes most reeves pretty good guys is that they have to be honest. And you would want an honest man as your reeve, because you know you don't want a guy swindling you, like the manciple. So you don't want a manciple managing your house, but you want a nice, you know, not frugal. You want a nice, loyal, and honest guy, and a little frugal as well, so they keep all your stuff in check, overseeing your property, and that's what the reeve kind of is. All right, so we got a couple more people to read through, and then we're almost done. Now, among us at the inn was a summoner. By the way, a summoner was like an officer or constable. Their job was to like summon, hence the word summoner, delinquents to appear in like a court. So basically bring criminals in. They enforce things like taxes. So in ancient days, in the middle period, that would be like the church taxes or the tithes. So the summoner would enforce those. And what makes this the thing about the summoner in like this kind of culture in the Middle Ages is that like the summoner is like think of it similar to like a temple guard. He's a temple guard, but he also acts as like a bailiff in like a courthouse. So it's kind of like a weird mesh of those roles. So think of like a temple guard, but they're also like they're kind of like cops as well. Not the best illustration, or maybe a good illustration depending on how you look at it. You'll see after we talk more about the summoner. But the summoner is kind of like a religious cop, or a cop of the church. So you know how our police officers are generally like designed to serve the public. Well, a summoner was like a specialized cop, hired to like serve at churches and the religious institution. Because of course that's how it would be in this Anglican society. So at the inn there was a summoner, who with slit eyes and a flaming red visage like a cherub's, all covered with pimples. He was as randy and lecherous as a sparrow. Children were afraid of his face, with its scabbed black eyebrows and scrabby beard. No mercury, white lead, sulfur, borax, ceruse, cream or tartar, or other ointments that cleanse and burn could rid him of his white pustules or the pimply knobs on his cheeks. He had a great love of garlic, onions, and leeks, and of drinking strong wine red as blood, which made him roar and gambol like a madman. When really drunk on wine, he'd speak nothing but Latin. He knew 2 or 3 tags that he learned from some decree or another, and no wonder, for he heard Latin all the day. But as you know, a jaybird can call out "what" as well as the Pope himself. Yet if you tried him further, you found out he was out of his depth. All he could do was parrot "Quaestio quid diris" over and over. By the way, that means like, what's the point? He was a tolerant, easygoing dog, as good a fellow as you might hope to find. For a quart of wine he'd allow any rascal of a priest to keep his concubine for a 12-month and excuse him altogether. On the other, he was well able to fleece Greenhorn on the sly. And if he found a fellow with a girl, he'd tell him not to worry about the Archdeacon's excommunication in such a case, unless he thought his purse was where his soul was kept. For it was in his purse it was in his purse he'd be punished. Your purse is the Archdeacon's hell, he would say. But I am sure he lied in his teeth. The guilty must fear excommunication, because it destroys the soul, just as absolution saves it. And they should also beware of the writ that sends them to prison. All the young people of his diocese were wholly under his thumb, for he was their confidant and sole adviser. Upon his head the summoner had set a garland as big as one of those they hang outside alehouses. He had a great round cake, which he carried like a shield. So yeah, the summoner. I know the jokes write themselves. He's a dirty cop. What else am I gonna say? How else do I describe the guy? He's a dirty cop. He's supposed to be like an upholder of the law. But like, you see how often he turns his eyes the other way? Like, if he, like, a guy's with a girl, you know what Chaucer means when he says that. When a guy's with a girl and the summoner finds out, he looks the other way, and we can I can keep it quiet, with the right amount. He's a dirty cop taking bribes, not a good guy. I mean, there's a reason why people have like negative stereotypes of cops. It's because of guys like this guy. The dirty cop that makes all cops look dirty. That's this guy. So, yeah, we'll see what Chaucer has else to say about guys like him. Now, with him rode a pardoner of Ronceville at Charing Cross, his friend and bosom companion, friend of the summoner, who had come straight from the Vatican at Rome. He loudly caroled, "Come hither, love to me," while the summoner sang the bass louder than the loudest trumpet. This pardoner's hair was waxy yellow and hung down as sleek as a hank of flax. Sorry, it's hard to see actually, because like it's kind of dark in here, and I don't want to turn the light on without it like making my face look weird. So I have to like hold the book in a funny way, and it kind of makes it hard to see sometimes. Anyway, the guy had long hair, sleek as a hank of flax. Such locks of hair as he possessed fell in Sorry, I should have actually checked some of these words. It's been a while since I've read this. Miager clusters spread over his shoulders, where it lay in thinly scattered strands. For comfort he wore no hood. It was packed in his bag. Okay, so I gotta explain this about these guys and their hoods. So everybody has like a hood, headdress, a coif, if you will. That's like a cloth that goes from like back here, and then you wear it over, but it doesn't cover your face. A coif is never supposed to cover your hair, your face, sorry. And so it kind of has like a stopping point that kind of like, it's like tight. You think of like, I'm trying to think of like a good example, like, think of like a ski mask, but without like the mask part. And so it comes all the way over, and that was the hood, and the hood's purpose was that, for religious reasons, people would wear this like cloth over their head, and so it just like covers your hair, but not your face. And so this hood everybody had, everybody has one of these like hoods, but this pardoner, the pardoner, who's supposed to, he works for the Vatican in Rome, so he's got close associations with like the Catholic Church, and yet he doesn't wear his hood. So something's up with that, because of course, Chaucer just described this guy as like super nice, blonde hair, and so he may be a little bit vain to not cover, not do the religious dues to cover his hair, but care more about his hair. He had great staring eyes, like a hare's. Upon his cap he sewn a small replica of Saint Veronica's handkerchief. His wallet lay on his lap in front of him, chock full of pardons hot from Rome. He's a thin goat-like voice, and no vestige or prospect of a beard, and his skin was smooth, just as it was shaven. I took him for a gelding or a mare, but as for his profession, from Berwick down to Ware, there was not another pardoner to touch him. For in his wallet he kept a pillow slip which, he said, was Our Lady's veil. He claimed to have a bit of the sail belonging to St. Peter when he tried to walk on the waves, and Jesus Christ caught him. He had a brass cross set with the pebbles, and a glass reliquary full of pig bones. Yet when he came across some poor country person, he could make more money with these relics in a day than a parson gets in 2 months. And thus he means of barefaced flattery and hocus pocus. He made the parson and the people he dupes. He made the parson and the people his dupes. To do him justice, in church at any rate, he was a fine ecclesiastic. Well could he read a lesson or a parable, but best of all, he sang the offertory hymn. Because after it was sung, he knew he must preach, as well, and knew well, to wheedle money from the congregation with his smooth tongue. Therefore, he sang all the louder and merrier. Just like the summoner, the pardoner, the jokes write themselves. Like, the first person in every if any Christian watching this, the first person that comes to mind when I just described the pardoner. Like, the jokes write themselves. I don't know if I can say it though. I don't want to get in trouble. But you think of like that your mega church, like superstar pastor that like they're supposedly like servants of God, but at the same time they also like have a private jet. That guy. Yeah, that's who the pardoner is, and he's got the smoothest tongue. He looks great. Once again, the jokes write themselves. They write themselves, and so what else I have to say about him? What else I have to say about the pardoner? So it's kind of funny that like the last two people Chaucer introduces are like the two dirtiest people. You got the dirty cop, and the particular pastor that we won't mention. And yeah, this is gonna be an interesting trip. Alright, let's finish this reading because we're actually near the end, and then we'll kind of do a Q&A if you guys have any questions, and then we'll kind of end the stream soon. Because I've already been at this for 2.5 hours, so let's speed run the rest of this. Now I have told you in a few words the class of person, dress, and number of our party, and the reason why it assembled in this excellent inn at Southwark, the tabard hard by the bell. And now it's time to tell you how we comported ourselves the night of our arrival at the inn. Afterwards I'll speak of our journey and the rest of our pilgrimage. But first I must beg you to be of good enough not to put it down to my lack of refinement in this manner. I mean, I totally get you, bro. I use plain language to give an account of their conversation and behavior, and when reporting their actual words. For you know as well as I do, whoever repeats a story told by another must reproduce as nearly as he can every word entrusted to him, no matter how uncouth or free the language, or else falsify the tale, or invent or find new words for it. Be the man his brother, he may not shrink. But whether words are used, he must also use. In the Bible, the language of Christ himself is outspoken. But as you well know, it's no breach of taste. Besides, Plato says, as anyone who can read him may see, the words must relate to the action. As I beg you to forgive me, in this account, I have not paid due attention to people's rank and order in which they should appear. My wits aren't too bright, as you may suppose. So TLDR of that little preface that Chaucer gives. What he's basically saying is, I'm gonna tell the stories as they are, and you're gonna hear some I'm gonna go for as accurate as possible, even if there's offensive language. That's the TLDR. So warning, there's gonna be coarse language. That's what he's getting at, because he's like, hey, I'm gonna be honest about this, and if there's gonna be offensive humor, there's gonna be coarse language, there's gonna be things that you don't like to hear, but I must report this accurately. That's what Chaucer's basically saying. Because trust me, with a colorful cast of characters like this, you're gonna get a colorful cast of stories, and so Chaucer's gonna let you know, I'm gonna keep the integrity of that. Which is important, you gotta tell things as they are. Don't sugarcoat it, because you don't want to falsify something and then make people believe something incorrectly. That's what this whole spiel of his is about. Our host welcomed each of us with open arms and soon led us to our places at the supper table. He served us with the finest viands and wine. He served us with the finest viands. The wine was strong, and we were in a mood to drink. Our host was a striking-looking fellow, a fit master of ceremonies for any hall. He was a big man with prominent eyes. There is no better-looking city burgess in Cheapside. Racy in his talk, shrewd yet civil. A proper man in every respect. Kind of ironic. To say he's racy in his talk means that he doesn't hesitate to drop a swear word here and there. Yet he's also a proper man in every respect. Ironic. What's more, he's a bit of a wag. For after supper, when we'd settle our bills among other things, he began to talk of amusing us, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, you're all most heartily welcome. For on my honor, I tell you no lie, when I say I've not seen such a jolly company as this under my roof at any one time this year. I like to provide you with some entertainment. If I know how to set about it, and I've just thought of a game that would amuse you and not cost a penny. You're off to Canterbury. Godspeed, and the blessed martyr reward you. And you mean to entertain yourselves by telling stories on the way. I'll be bound, for there's certainly no sense of fun in riding along as dumb as stones. And so, as I said before, I'll devise a game that'll give you some amusement. If it pleases you all to accept my decision unanimously, and to do as I tell you, when you ride off tomorrow." Oh, obligatory water noises. Okay, I think the water noise is mostly gone. Okay, so I did fix the lighting a little bit. I know I'm gonna look like brighter now, but it's also like getting dark in here because it's. I know we've hit March, but it's still technically winter, and it gets dark early around here. I mean, it's like what 5:35, so it's dark outside almost already. I mean, sunset has already begun. So anyway, back to where I was. Okay, I'll actually go back a little bit. I'll reread part of it. You're off to Canterbury. Godspeed, and the blessed martyr reward you. And you mean to entertain yourselves by telling stories on the way. I'll be bound, for there's certainly no sense or fun in riding along as dumb as stones. And so, as I said before, I'll devise a game that'll give you some amusement. If it pleases you all to accept my decision unanimously, and to do as I'll tell you when you ride off tomorrow, then I swear by my father's soul you can have my head if you don't enjoy yourselves. Not another word. Hands up, everyone! It didn't take long for us to make our minds. We saw no point in deliberating, but agreed to his proposal without further argument, and asked him to give what commands he liked. Ladies and gentlemen, began the host, do yourselves a good turn and listen to what I say. And please, don't turn up your noses at this. This is the point in a nutshell. Each of you, to make the road even shorter, shall tell 2 stories on the journey. I mean 2 on the way to Canterbury, and 2 others on the way home. Tales of once upon a time. Whoever tells his story best, that's to say, whoever spins the most edifying and amusing tale, is to be given a dinner at the expense of the rest of us. Here in this inn, and under this very roof, when we return from Canterbury, and just to make it the more fun for you, I'll gladly ride with you myself at my own cost and be your guide. Anyone who gainsays my judgment shall pay all our expenses on the road. Now if you agree, let me know here and now without any more ado, and I'll make my arrangements. I'll make my arrangements early. The matter was agreed, and we gave our promises gladly, begging him to do as he proposed and be our leader, judge and arbiter of our tales, and arrange a dinner at a set price. We agreed to be ruled by his decision in every respect, and thus we unanimously submitted ourselves to his judgment. Thereupon more wine was fetched, and when we had drunk it all, we went to bed without further delay. Next morning our host rose up at the break of day, roused us all, and gathered us together in a flock. We rode off at little more than a walking pace until we came to a watering place of St. Thomas, where our host reined his horse and said, Attention, please, ladies and gentlemen. You know what you promised, remember? If you're of the same mind this morning as you were last night, then let's see who's to tell the first tale. Whoever rebels against my ruling must pay for everything we spend upon the road, or may I never drink another drop. Now let's draw lots before going further. Sir Knight, he said, will your honor draw lots? For that is my decree. Come nearer, my lady prioress, and you too, master scholar. Lay aside that difference and come out of your brown study. All hands draw lots. Upon this everyone began drawing lots, and in fine, whether by luck or fate or chance, the truth is that to everyone's delight, the lot fell to the knight. Because he's an old man, he sucks at these games. Now he must tell his tale, as was right and proper according to the bargain. I have described, what more can I say? And when that good man saw how things are, he very sensibly obeyed the promise he had freely given and said, since I must begin the game. Why? Then welcome be the luck of the draw, in God's name. Now let us ride on, and listen to what I say. With that we began to ride forward on our way, and at once he cheerfully began his tale, which went like this. That's where we're going to end for today. I know, I spent 3 hours reading 20 pages. A slower stream today because we had to introduce everybody and introduce a lot of ideas. But I promise that as we go through, the stories will go a lot faster. And this one's going to take a while because I'll probably end up like reading maybe... The plan is I'll probably read like 1, maybe 2 tales per stream. Depends on how long the tale is, because the night has like a pretty long one, but some of them are pretty short. So we'll see how I'll kind of plan out how many we're gonna read. Next week we'll just read the Knight's Tale, because this is pretty long, but that is for next week. And the Canterbury Tales is gonna take us a while. I may just go the simpler route and just read one tale, but like for instance, like one person's tale is like super short. So maybe that one will like cram into another one, but for the most part we'll kind of go like one tale per stream. So the Canterbury Tales is gonna take us like a good 16 streams, maybe even like up to 20 streams. This will be our big reading project for the year. I shouldn't hold it so far. I gotta hold it closer so that it doesn't get all blurry. But this will be our reading project for basically half the year. We spent half the year reading the Canterbury Tales. I look forward to reading it with you and us having a good laugh over some of these stories. And so, with that said, that's it for the Canterbury Tales for today. Just do a bit of housekeeping, and then we're going to end the stream. So, as you know, we're back in full action here. We have 2 game streams. We have Throwback Thursday videos and reading stream every week. At least that's the plan. So next week, we are scheduled for our Octopath Traveler 2 streams. We have Monday and Wednesdays at 2 o'clock Pacific time. This week we're on for Octopath Traveler 2 on Monday at 2 o'clock. So I definitely hope you guys will come hang out for that. We'll read The Knight's Tale next Friday at 3 o'clock. So keep your eyes peeled for that if you guys are enjoying this read and hope to hear more of the Canterbury Tales. Don't forget to subscribe, hit those bell notifications so that you guys know when I'm back. You guys can also just kind of message me on Discord and I can always just type it down for you in case you can't remember. You know, word of mouth here. But with that said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed the Canterbury Tales introduction. And I will see you guys on Monday at 2 o'clock Pacific time for Octopath Traveler 2. Until then, I hope you guys have a great Friday night, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. Until then, God bless you, and have a good night.